The hotel sat at the end of a long, winding road, nestled between a dense thicket of trees and the forgotten remnants of an old railway station. The world outside seemed quiet, untouched by time. The sky was perpetually grey, like the town itself had been forgotten by the sun. Its faded walls, the crumbling wooden steps, and the rusted iron gate all whispered stories of neglect. A sense of abandonment lingered in the air, but so too did something darker, something the town could not, or perhaps did not, want to acknowledge. It was in this forgotten place that the Hillcrest Hotel stood, an oddly stubborn monument to a time long past. To anyone passing through, it was just another decaying relic, one of many in this desolate stretch of land. But to those who lived nearby, it was something more, something they'd learned to avoid. Locals rarely spoke about it, and when they did, they spoke in low voices, as if saying the name aloud would summon something worse. The town was small, not much more than a handful of houses and an old general store, but it carried the weight of secrets that had festered for decades. Max and Claire had been traveling for hours. Their car's engine hummed steadily along the lonely road, but the isolation of the area made Claire uneasy. She glanced out the window, her fingers gripping the edge of her seat. "This place feels like it's been forgotten," she muttered, her voice soft, almost wistful. "Look at how everything's just decaying." Max laughed softly, turning to her. "What? You think we're going to find a ghost in a rundown hotel? It's just an old building. It'll be fine." Claire smiled weakly. She had wanted a break from the chaos of their busy lives, and this secluded getaway, far from the noise and demands of the city, had seemed like the perfect place. But as they drew closer to the Hillcrest Hotel, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The more she looked at the looming structure ahead, the more her unease grew. The hotel had been closed for years, or so they thought. The brochure that had drawn them in described it as a quaint retreat for people looking to escape the world. Yet, there was nothing quaint about it. The windows were dark, no lights shining from within, and the once grand sign hanging above the entrance was now crooked and covered in layers of peeling paint. The front door creaked on its hinges, half open, inviting them in with a strange sense of familiarity. Max pulled the car up in front of the hotel, the tires crunching over gravel as they parked. The air felt colder here, and as Claire stepped out of the car, she noticed the unsettling stillness that hung in the air. It was like the world had stopped moving. She could hear the faint rustling of the wind through the trees, but that was all. "Maybe it's just really old," Claire said, trying to convince herself. She felt a chill crawl down her spine, but she ignored it. Max was already making his way to the front door, swinging it open and stepping inside without a second thought. "Come on, it's an adventure," he called back to her, his voice echoing off the empty hallways. Reluctantly, Claire followed him inside. The lobby was dim, the only light coming from the pale glow filtering through the dust-covered windows. The walls were lined with dark, faded wood paneling, and a thick carpet covered the floor, worn and threadbare in spots. The air was stale, heavy with the scent of mildew and something faintly sour. It felt as though time had stopped here, that the hotel had been waiting for something to bring it back to life, or perhaps to end its long silence. Max seemed oblivious to the atmosphere, strolling across the room with his usual easy confidence. "Not bad, huh?" he said, looking around at the dusty furnishings and the faded yellowed wallpaper. Claire didn't answer immediately. She stood by the door, her eyes scanning the room. Her mind buzzed with odd thoughts, her senses heightened, as if the air itself was thick with something waiting to happen. Her gaze fell on a portrait on the far wall, an old dark painting of a man and woman standing in front of the hotel. The woman's eyes were wide, glassy, and empty, as if she had been staring at something far beyond the frame. Claire's breath caught in her throat as she stared at the unsettling image. There was something unnatural about the way the woman's eyes seemed to follow her, no matter where she stood. Max noticed her staring. "You okay?" Claire blinked, breaking her trance. "Yeah, just tired, the check-in desk, where Abel sat, dusty, untouched. He rang it loudly, and the sound echoed through the empty building, almost too loud in the eerie silence. There was no answer. Claire felt the hair on the back of her neck rise. She wasn't sure why, but she didn't like the feeling of being so alone in this place. It was like they were intruding on something that had been dormant for too long. Before she could voice her concern, the creak of a door opening from behind the counter made both of them freeze. A figure emerged slowly. A man, tall and thin, with an odd, twisted smile plastered across his face. His skin was pale, almost too pale, and his eyes were dark, sunken into his face like the eyes of someone who hadn't seen sunlight in years. He wore an old grey suit, the fabric fraying at the edges. "Welcome to the Hillcrest," he said, his voice unnaturally deep and slow. "I trust you'll be staying the night?" Max nodded, still smiling, though Claire could feel the unease in his voice. "Yeah, we're just looking for a place to crash for the night. It's quiet here, right?" The man's smile widened slightly, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Oh, very quiet. You'll find peace here, if you don't mind the silence." He handed them a key, the metal cold in Claire's palm. Max didn't seem to notice the man's odd demeanor, but Claire couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. "Thanks," she said, her voice tight. The man watched them closely as they made their way to the stairs. His gaze lingered just a moment too long, and Claire could have sworn she heard a faint, unsettling whisper in her ear as they passed. When she looked back, the man was gone, disappearing into the shadows of the lobby. Max led the way up the staircase, the floorboards creaking underfoot with every step. They reached the top, and Claire's eyes flicked to the dark hallway before them. The walls were lined with more portraits, faces that seemed unfamiliar, and yet somehow there was something so haunting about their expressions. Max stopped in front of a door and turned to Claire. "Here we are, room 217. This place isn't half bad. Maybe you're just tired from the drive." But Claire's mind was already elsewhere. She couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't alone here. Something was watching them. Something that had been waiting in the shadows. The first night at the Hillcrest Hotel was supposed to be an escape, a break from the monotony of everyday life. Max had been too eager to explore the decaying old building, poking through its rooms and corridors, as if he didn't feel the strange tension in the air. Claire, however, couldn't shake the sense of unease that had clung to her the moment they'd stepped inside. It was as if the hotel had a pulse, an unseen force that was watching them, waiting for something. By the time they had reached their room, the oppressive silence had already started to sink in. It was the kind of silence that felt suffocating, as if the whole building was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Max had been in high spirits, cracking jokes as he tossed their bags onto the bed and started rifling through his phone. Claire, on the other hand, found herself standing by the window, peering out at the unrelenting grey sky and the dense trees beyond. The longer she stared into the woods, the more she felt like something was staring back at her. There was a faint rustling in the distance, too rhythmic to be the wind, but too far away to be anything identifiable. She tried to convince herself it was just the trees shifting in the breeze, but the unease in her chest grew. "I'm going to grab some water from downstairs," Max called, pulling Claire from her thoughts. "You want anything?" "No, I'm fine," she said quickly, though she wasn't sure if she truly was. She felt a twinge of fear, but she brushed it off. "It's just the isolation," she told herself. "Nothing to be afraid of. Nothing at all." Max stepped out, leaving her alone in the room. Claire turned away from the window, her eyes drifting to the old wooden wardrobe by the wall. It was massive, its doors slightly ajar, revealing only darkness inside. Her fingers itched to close it, but a strange reluctance kept her rooted to the spot. Something about it felt wrong, out of place. The air in the room grew colder, despite the warmth of the heating system humming softly in the corner. Claire shivered and wrapped her arms around herself. She thought she heard something, a faint whisper, like a breath brushing against the back of her neck. Spinning around, her heart leapt into her throat. But there was nothing. The room was still. No one else was there. The silence felt heavier now, pressing down on her chest. She glanced at the door, her mind racing with irrational thoughts. Had Max already gone downstairs? Had he sent a rush of panic through her? Number Max was fine. He was downstairs, just getting water. But why did it feel like he wasn't coming back? Why did the shadows in the corners of the room seem to stretch further every time she blinked? She shook her head, trying to focus on something rational. The moment was getting to her. She needed to breathe, to calm down. Then the door to the wardrobe creaked. She froze, her eyes snapping to the dark gap between the wardrobe's doors. It was barely audible, just a faint shift in the wood, but it was enough to send a ripple of dread through her body. "Max?" she called out, her voice unsteady. No answer. Claire's breath quickened as she stepped toward the wardrobe. She told herself to stop being paranoid. It was just an old building, the kind of place that made creaking noises from time to time. But as her hand reached for the wardrobe door, her fingers brushed against the cold wood, and a shiver ran down her spine. Before she could open it, the sound of footsteps echoed from the hallway outside. Claire jumped, pulling her hand back. She rushed to the door, her heart hammering in her chest. "Max?" she asked, her voice trembling now. The footsteps stopped. For a second, all she could hear was the pounding of her own pulse in her ears. Then the door to their room opened. It wasn't Max who stepped inside. The man who entered the room was tall, his features sharp, almost skeletal, with hollowed-out eyes that seemed to absorb the light. He wore an old-fashioned hotel uniform, the dark fabric faded and worn, and his smile was wide, too wide. It was the same man from downstairs, the one who had checked them in. "Is something wrong?" he asked in a slow, almost deliberate drawl. "You seem unsettled." Claire took a step back, her stomach lurching. I thought you were someone else." The man's gaze lingered on her, his eyes never blinking. He didn't answer immediately, just stared at her, as though trying to gauge her response. Claire's throat tightened. There was something so off about him. She couldn't explain it, but it felt as if the man was seeing through her, not really seeing her at all. "Everything here is peaceful," he said finally, his voice lilting, almost too calm. But some things can disturb the quiet. Her eyes flicked to the door, her mind screaming to leave. "Max is just downstairs," she said, a statement more than a question. "He'll be right back." The man nodded slowly, his smile never wavering. "Of course, he'll be right back." But something in his tone made her wonder if he already knew that wasn't true. Claire felt a sudden, inexplicable coldness sweep over her, a sharp chill that settled deep within her bones. The man didn't move, didn't blink, just stood there watching her. She glanced at the door again, but before she could speak, the door to the wardrobe creaked open. Her eyes shot to the wardrobe, her heart skipping a beat. There was nothing there. The darkness inside seemed to stretch, as if the room itself was holding its breath. The man's lips curled into a slow, unsettling smile. "Go ahead," he said, his voice soft. "You can look." A cold sweat broke out on Claire's forehead as she stepped back, unable to tear her eyes away from the open wardrobe. It was as though the room itself was pulling her in, making her feel drawn to that dark space. Then the door slammed shut. Claire gasped, her pulse racing. The man's smile faded, his eyes hardening as he stared at her. "The quiet isn't always as peaceful as it seems," he murmured, his voice barely a whisper. Max's voice suddenly rang out from the hall. "Claire, you okay?" The man turned toward the door, as though expecting him. "He's coming back," the man said, almost to himself. "But will he find you? Will he see you?" With a final look, the man stepped back into the shadows, vanishing into the hallway just as Max entered the room. "Who was that?" Max asked, eyebrows raised. "What's wrong?" Claire turned to him. her breath shaky, her eyes wide. I don't know. Max, I don't think we're supposed to be here. Max glanced around, his expression softening with concern. You're just tired. It's an old hotel, Claire. Let's just get some sleep, all right? We'll figure this out tomorrow. But Claire wasn't sure sleep would come. Not tonight. The shadows in the corners of the room were too thick, the air too heavy. She felt something lurking just beyond her vision, and it wasn't Max's presence she feared. It was the silence, the oppressive, smothering silence that wrapped itself around them both. And the man, the one who had warned her. Something had awoken in the Hillcrest Hotel, and whatever it wasn't going to let them leave so easily. The night stretched on like a living thing, heavy and suffocating. Claire lay on the bed, the covers pulled tightly around her, though they did little to stave off the chill that clung to the room. Max had fallen asleep beside her, his deep, steady breathing the only sound breaking the silence. But Claire couldn't sleep, not with the fear gnawing at her insides, not with the image of the man lingering in her mind. He's just a strange hotel clerk, she tried to convince herself, her fingers tracing the rough texture of the blanket. Nothing more. But something wasn't right. There was something wrong about the way he'd watched her, something that made her skin crawl. And it wasn't just him. It was the whole place, the way the walls seemed to groan under the weight of the silence, the way the shadows in the corners of the room had started to move. Her mind was running wild, jumping from one thought to the next. But no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't shake the feeling that the hotel had eyes that were watching her, waiting. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed through the hall. Claire bolted upright in bed, heart slamming against her chest. Max stirred beside her, muttering incoherently in his sleep. The sound had come from the floor above. Something had fallen, something heavy. Her blood ran cold. Max, she whispered, shaking his shoulder. Max, wake up. He groggily opened his eyes, blinking against the dim light. What's wrong? Did you hear that? She asked, her voice trembling. Max frowned, rubbing his face with his hands. It's just an old building. It's probably a window or something. Don't worry. But Claire wasn't reassured. She could feel the hairs on the back of her neck standing on end, the pit in her stomach growing deeper. Before she could say anything else, the door to their room creaked open. Max shot upright, his eyes wide. Who the hell? But no one stood there. The hallway outside was empty, the door hanging open just slightly. The faint whisper of wind filtered into the room, but there was nothing else. The silence pressed in again, thick and suffocating. Claire looked at Max, her eyes wide with panic. That wasn't the wind. Someone's here. Max didn't seem to hear her. His gaze was fixed on the open door, a frown creasing his forehead. Okay, this is starting to freak me out. I'll go check it out. He stood and walked toward the door, his footsteps slow and deliberate. Claire stood frozen at the edge of the bed, her heart thudding in her chest. As Max reached the door, he glanced back at her, his face pale. I'll be right back, he said, but his voice sounded hollow, distant. Claire didn't move as Max stepped out into the hallway. The shadows in the corners of the room felt darker now, like they were pressing in on her. She could hear his footsteps, soft and slow, fading as he moved farther down the hall. Minutes passed, but Max didn't return. Claire's pulse quickened. She couldn't just sit here, alone. She had to find him. Her feet were shaking as she grabbed the flashlight from the bedside table and rushed to the door. The hallway outside was eerily quiet. The faint glow from the emergency lights cast long shadows on the walls, but there was no sign of Max. No sign of anyone. Max? She called out, her voice trembling. No answer. She swallowed hard and stepped into the hallway, her flashlight beam dancing over the walls. She moved cautiously, every creak of the floorboards beneath her feet sending her heart into her throat. Her senses were on high alert, and every noise, every movement felt magnified. It was as if the very building itself was alive, breathing with her, pulsing with something far darker than any old hotel could hold. The footsteps, they were back, but this time, they weren't Max's. They were heavy, slow, dragging. like someone, or something, was stumbling down the hall. Claire's breath got in her throat. Her legs felt like they were made of stone, but she forced herself to move forward, her pulse hammering in her ears. As she rounded the corner, she caught a glimpse of something moving in the darkness. A figure. It was tall, hunched, like a shadow stretched too thin, too long. The figure was dragging something behind it, a trail of darkness pooling in its wake. Its face was obscured by shadows, but Claire could feel the weight of its eyes burning into her from the depths of the darkness. Her breath hitched, her heart pounding, as the figure stopped at the end of the hallway. It turned slowly, its body twisting unnaturally, as if the bones inside it were no longer working in harmony with the flesh. Number Claire froze. She couldn't move. She couldn't breathe. The figure raised its head, blank, featureless mass of pale skin. Its eyes were wide, glassy, and empty, just like the woman in the portrait downstairs. It stared at her, its mouth opening slightly as if to speak, but no sound came. Instead, the air grew colder, and Claire felt the weight of an unseen presence pressing against her chest, choking her. The thing began to move toward her, its footsteps heavy and deliberate. Claire's body snapped back into motion. She spun and ran, her feet barely touching the ground as she hurtled back toward the room. But the thing was faster, much faster. She could hear its dragging steps growing closer, feel the cold creeping up her spine as it reached for her, its hands skeletal and long, the fingers reaching out like claws. With a desperate scream, Claire slammed the door shut behind her and threw the deadbolt in place. Her breath came in short, ragged gasps as she backed away from the door, eyes wide with terror. Maximum. Where was Max? The flashlight fell from her trembling hands, casting an erratic beam across the room. It landed on the wall, illuminating the portrait of the couple again. The woman's empty eyes were fixed on Claire now. Only, they were no longer just staring. They were watching her. "Max!" Claire cried, stumbling toward the door. "Max!" But there was no answer. No sound from the hallway. The lights flickered, casting everything in an eerie, strobe-like rhythm. And then the door shook. It rattled violently, the hinges screeching in protest as something pounded against it from the other side. The thing, it was here. With a final gut-wrenching cry, Claire backed away, the cold presence growing stronger in the room. The shadows on the walls seemed to twist and writhe, moving with a mind of their own. And then, with a sickening snap, the door broke open. The thing stood there, its pale, lifeless face staring at her, and behind it, the hallway stretched on, longer than it had ever been, as if the hotel itself had swallowed everything around her. In that moment, Claire realized what it was. It was not just the hotel that was haunted. It was the land itself. The curse had been woven into the very fabric of this place, into the walls, the floorboards, the air. And now, there was no escape. The thing took a step forward. Mags was gone. And as Claire's mind shattered beneath the weight of her terror, she knew one thing for sure. Whatever had taken him, whatever had taken this hotel, it wasn't going to let her leave either. The morning light never felt so distant. When Claire finally woke, it wasn't to the soft warmth of daylight spilling through the window, but to a chilling, unnatural stillness. Her body was stiff, her muscles sore from the hours of tension. But there was something more, a strange, heavy weight that pressed against her chest. The room was exactly as it had been the night before. The bed where she and Max had lain still made, the window closed, and the air cold with the remnants of a night that shouldn't have ended. She didn't remember falling asleep. As she sat up, her head spun, dizziness overwhelming her for a moment. The events of the previous night rushed back. Max's disappearance, the terrifying figure in the hall, the thing in the room. But there was no sign of any of it now. No eerie shadows, no cold air, nothing. The room felt like a tomb, silent and empty, as if the night's horror had been a distant nightmare. But deep down, Claire knew better. Max was gone. Her stomach lurched as she stood, the world around her shifting, growing uncertain. She couldn't remember how long it had been since she'd last seen him. Hours? Days? Her fingers trembled as she reached for the door, the familiar sound of the old hotel settling beneath her feet. Her pulse quickened. Was he really gone? Or had it all been some twisted hallucination? She stepped out into the hallway. The floor creaked beneath her weight, the smell of aged wood and dust hanging heavy in the air. There was no sign of Max, no sign of the thing. The hallway stretched out before her, just like it had the night before. It felt so impossibly normal, too normal. The oppressive tension of the hotel had faded, but it left behind something worse, an absence. There were no footsteps behind her, no voices in the distance, nothing. "Max?" she whispered, her voice breaking. But the sound only echoed in the quiet, mocking her. She walked down the hall, each step feeling like it could be her last, the weight of the building pressing on her chest like a suffocating blanket. She passed the room where she and Max had stayed, the door slightly ajar. The bed was undisturbed, the space still as if nothing had happened. But Claire knew. Her heart pounded in her chest as she approached the front desk. The clerk, the man, was sitting behind the counter, his eyes vacant and distant, as if nothing out of the ordinary had ever occurred. He was still wearing that same uniform, his expression unchanged as though he had never left, his gaze empty. "Good morning," he said, his voice eerily calm, too calm. Claire's breath caught in her throat. She opened her mouth to speak, but the words caught, unable to form around the terror that clawed at her insides. She needed to ask, she needed to know, but part of her, a small, terrified part of her, didn't want to hear the answer. "What happened to Max?" she finally managed to ask, her voice barely a whisper. The clerk's lips curled upward into a smile, unnatural, cold, and knowing. "Max?" he asked, his voice soft, almost as though he was savoring the word. "Oh, Max is gone. Gone." Her knees buckled beneath her, and she collapsed into a chair, her body trembling. "What do you mean gone?" she forced out, her eyes burning with unshed tears. The clerk's smile only deepened. "Gone where he belongs, to the land." Claire's stomach churned, the words echoing in her mind like a drumbeat, each one pounding with the weight of a truth she didn't want to understand. She wanted to scream, to run, to demand more, but the clerk's eyes, their hollow, empty gaze, held her in place, rooting her to the chair as though the world itself had become nothing more than a cruel, mocking joke. She looked down at her hands, her fingers trembling. She was losing herself. Was she even real anymore? Was any of this real? The hotel, the clerk, the hallways, they all felt like they belonged to someone else, something else. They had to. The clerk leaned forward, his voice almost a whisper. "The land never forgets, not even the souls who try to leave." Her chest tightened. She knew what he meant. She understood in a way she couldn't explain, a way that felt like a deep, gnawing truth at the back of her mind. The land, the hotel, the things she had seen in the hallway. It wasn't just a nightmare. It was a curse, a living, breathing part of the world, part of the land itself. And once it claimed you, there was no escaping. Not Max, not Claire, not anyone. The hotel had claimed them all. The land never forgets. Claire stood, her legs shaky beneath her as she backed away from the desk, unable to tear her gaze from the clerk's cold, unblinking eyes. She had to get out. She had to leave, to escape, before the hotel decided she was just as much a part of it as Max had been. But the door to the outside was no longer where it had been. The hallway stretched on, impossibly long, twisting as if it were pulling her deeper into itself. The hotel was alive. It had always been alive. Claire stumbled backward, her hand fumbling for something to hold on to. The hotel walls closed in, warping around her, distorting as if the very structure of reality was fraying at the edges. She could feel it now, the pressure, the grip of the hotel's truth tightening around her, forcing her into a small, suffocating box where escape was no longer possible. And then the whispers started, low, unintelligible at first, but growing louder, surrounding her, pulling at her thoughts, dragging her under. It was the land. The land was talking to her, speaking in voices she couldn't understand, calling to her, like it had called to Max, to everyone who had ever stayed here. She couldn't breathe, and then a faint sound, almost imperceptible, made her freeze. The softest of footsteps, muffled and slow, coming from behind her. Claire didn't turn around. She couldn't. Instead, she squeezed her eyes shut, and as the whispers turned into screams, she heard the sound of a voice, Max's voice, call out to her, distant and broken. "It's too late, Claire. You can't leave. You never could." Her body shook with the force of the truth, the suffocating weight of it crashing down on her. She was part of the hotel now. She always had been. The land never forgets, and neither does the hotel. It had claimed her, and when the morning sun rose once more, it would find her just another lost soul, wandering the hallways of the Hillcrest Hotel, waiting for the next unsuspecting traveler to wander into its grasp. The town around the Hillcrest Hotel never changed. The morning fog still clung to the streets, heavy and damp, the sun trying to pierce through it, but never quite succeeding. The same crumbling buildings stood on the corner. The same old trees reached their gnarled branches towards the sky. Life in the town had continued as if nothing had ever happened, as if the horrors that had unfolded within the hotel's walls had never touched the world outside. She knew that some things could never be erased, not by time, not by distance. No matter how hard she tried to push the memory of the hotel out of her mind, the shadows remained, lurking in every corner, every space where the light didn't quite reach. It had been months since she left the Hillcrest. The police had come and gone, their questions fading into the noise of empty bureaucracy. Max was never found. The hotel? No one spoke of it anymore. The stories had been buried, the rooms stripped and closed off to new guests. But there was no official explanation. No one wanted to acknowledge what had happened there. Some things were better left forgotten. And Claire tried to forget too. But you can never truly outrun something that has touched you so deeply, so intimately. It wasn't just the hotel that had claimed Max. It was something older, something that had always been there, waiting. And now it had marked Claire too, whether she liked it or not. She had gone back, just once, after the police left, after the initial investigation faded into history. The hotel stood in the same place, as if it had always been there. Nothing had changed, and yet everything was different. The air still smelled the same, musty, damp, with that faint touch of decay that clung to every surface. But now, there was a new chill, a heavy silence that was too still, as though it was holding its breath, waiting. Claire had walked the halls again, not as a guest but as someone who had been touched by something she couldn't explain. The portrait of the couple still hung in the lobby, their eyes still dark and hollow, watching. But it was the hallway, the long corridor stretching endlessly, that chilled her to the bone. She had walked down that same hall where the figure had come for her. Only now it felt different, alive. She had turned back, unable to stand the oppressive weight of it. The land that never forgets. She couldn't find it again. The hotel was still there, but it had disappeared, just as it always did. It was like it had shifted, or maybe it had never truly been real in the first place, as if the hotel existed only in the space between reality and the unknown, an entity that twisted and changed, its shape mutable, depending on who entered its doors. For a moment, she almost thought she imagined the whole thing. The terror, the darkness, Max's disappearance. Was it all just a product of her mind cracking under the weight of something too horrific to understand? But the dream kept coming. Max was still there, his face pale and distant, staring at her through the cracks in the darkness. His voice, faint but unmistakable, calling to her from the void. "Claire, you know we're all part of it now. There's no escape." Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the hallway. She saw the shadows, heard the dragging footsteps, felt the weight of the thing in the dark. But it wasn't just the hotel she feared. It was her own mind. The hotel had broken her. And yet, that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the whispers. They had started again, soft at first, just in the corners of her thoughts, a faint murmur in the back of her mind. But they had grown louder, clearer. She thought she heard them at night, as she lay in bed, trying to sleep, or when she was alone, walking through the darkened streets. The whispers grew familiar, like a language she once knew, a language she feared. They were the voices of the hotel, of the land, of Max. But there was one voice, a new voice, that terrified her more than any other. It was her own. Come back. She hadn't realized at first, but one night, lying awake in the dark, she had heard it. Her voice, whispering her name, not in the way she had imagined it, not in a reassuring, familiar tone, but a hollow, desperate plea, a pull deep and insistent, tugging at her like an invisible chain. It was then that she knew she had never truly escaped. The hotel wasn't something you could leave, not when it had marked you, when the land had claimed you. It wasn't just about leaving a building, it was about leaving a piece of you behind. The memories of the hotel, the creature in the hall, Max's fading voice, none of it was gone. It had followed her, and she knew that one day it would pull her back. The thought haunted her, gnawed at her mind, until it was a constant companion in her waking hours. It was always there, just at the edge of her thoughts. Claire tried to ignore it, tried to convince herself that the hotel was nothing more than a figment of her imagination, a nightmare she would eventually wake from. But deep down she knew the truth. The hotel was not a place. It was a force, a presence, and it was patient. As Claire walked through the town, the mist rolled in heavier than usual, obscuring the familiar landmarks, the streets she knew so well. The feeling was the same as that first night she had arrived at the hill crest. The sense that she was being watched, that something was waiting. She turned a corner and stopped. There, just ahead, was the hotel, its silhouette looming in the fog, standing tall against the dimming sky, a dark presence in the heart of the town. It was exactly as she remembered, but at the same time, it felt different. It was closer somehow, a shadow in her peripheral vision, a thing that had always been there, waiting to pull her back into its cold embrace. The doors were closed, locked tight, but in that moment, as Claire stood on the sidewalk, staring at the hotel, the whispers grew louder. She could hear them now, unmistakable, clear as day. Come back, Claire. Her heart skipped a beat. She wasn't sure if it was her own voice or if it was the hotel, the land. It didn't matter. She had heard it, and now she couldn't unhear it. Claire didn't turn around. She couldn't. The pull was too strong, the draw too powerful. She stepped forward, and just like that, the hotel was waiting for her. The door swung open, welcoming her back into the darkness. It would never let her go, and it never truly let anyone leave. Not really.